You planted it. It bloomed. Then, it never came back. You spent an afternoon out in the backyard digging holes, planting carefully, and watering everything exactly the way you thought you should. Maybe your knees reminded you of it the next day. Maybe your back did too. But you did the work. You planted it. You watered it. You watched it bloom that first summer. And naturally, you expected it to come back the following year. Instead, the space was empty. Or worse, a weak little plant limped along and never really recovered. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Every year, gardeners across America lose perennial plants they fully expected to enjoy for years, sometimes decades. And surprisingly, the problem usually doesn't begin in winter. It begins much earlier. In June, most gardeners assume a perennial that looks healthy is already established. But that's where the mistake begins. A newly planted perennial is not the same thing as a perennial that's been growing in the same location for years. It may look established. It may bloom like an established plant. But underground, the root system is still developing. And if that first summer goes badly, the plant may never become the long-lived perennial it was meant to be. Before we get started, drop your state or USDA hardiness zone in the comments below. I read every comment, and it helps shape the gardening videos you see here every week. Today we're looking at 7 backyard perennials that really can come back year after year. Some can last for decades, but only if you help them through that critical first season. And we're starting with one of the longest-lived plants on today's list. Number 1 is Peony. There are gardeners growing peonies today that were planted before they were born. That's part of what makes these plants so special. When they're happy, they stay put for decades. Every spring, they produce those huge, dramatic blooms that make people stop and look. They're one of the classic plants of the American garden. But they're also responsible for a surprising amount of frustration. Not because they're difficult, because people often assume they're established long before they actually are. Here's how the June mistake shows up. A gardener plants a peony. The plant survives its first winter. Fresh growth appears in spring. Everything looks promising. And that's usually the moment people assume the hard part is over. But it isn't. What you're seeing above ground doesn't always reflect what's happening below ground. The root system is still expanding. The plant is still settling in. And that first full growing season matters far more than most people realize. As June turns into July, watering often becomes less consistent. The peony looks healthy, so it gets treated like an established plant. But it isn't established yet. What to do instead? Help the plant through that first summer. Deep watering during dry periods encourages stronger root development and gives the plant a much better chance of becoming the long-lived perennial it's capable of being. And there's another mistake worth mentioning, one that showed up repeatedly in comments from gardeners struggling with peonies. The plant doesn't bloom the way they expected. The location doesn't seem ideal. So they move it, then move it again. The problem is that peonies dislike being disturbed once they're trying to establish themselves. Every move forces the plant to spend energy rebuilding roots instead of strengthening them. If you're gardening in zones 3 through 8, patience is often one of the best things you can give a peony. Give it water, give it time, give it consistency, because once established, few perennials reward patience quite like this one. And speaking of plants with a reputation for toughness, the next perennial may be one of the most misunderstood on today's list. Number 2 is Daylily. If you've ever driven through an older neighborhood in summer, you've probably seen mature daylilies growing beside driveways, along fences, or around mailboxes. They seem almost impossible to kill. Year after year, they just keep coming back. That's exactly why so many gardeners get fooled by them. Because mature daylilies create the illusion that daylilies are tough from day one. But that's not what you're actually seeing. You're seeing years of root development. You're seeing an established plant. Here's how the June mistake usually happens. A gardener plants a new daylily in spring. Everything looks good. The leaves are healthy. Maybe it even blooms. Then June arrives. Temperatures climb. Rain becomes less predictable. And because daylilies are known for being tough, watering becomes less frequent. After all, the mature clump down the street seems perfectly fine. The one growing beside your neighbor's driveway never gets watered. So surely this new one doesn't need much help either. That's the assumption. And that's the mistake. The mature daylily in your neighbor's yard may have years of root development underground. Your newly planted daylily doesn't. Not yet. What to do instead? Treat the first summer differently. Deep watering once or twice each week during dry periods helps roots grow deeper and establish the foundation that supports the plant for years to come. Think of it this way. You're not watering for this month's flowers. You're watering for the next 20 years. Daylilies are hardy throughout zones 3 through 9, and once established, their reputation is absolutely deserved. They're dependable, they're resilient, and they keep returning long after many other plants have disappeared. But that toughness comes later, not during the first June. And the next perennial on our list teaches that same lesson in a completely different way. The next plant on our list creates a completely different misunderstanding. Number 3 is coneflower. Over the last several years, coneflowers have become one of the most popular perennial plants in America. Pollinators love them, gardeners love them, and once established, they're known for handling difficult conditions surprisingly well. In fact, many people think of coneflowers as one of the best drought-tolerant perennials you can grow. And that's exactly where the June mistake begins. A gardener hears the phrase, drought-tolerant. They bring home a young coneflower. They plant it. The plant settles in nicely. Everything looks healthy. And because coneflowers have such a strong reputation for toughness, they assume the plant can already handle long stretches without water. But that's not what drought-tolerant really means. At least not yet. The mature coneflowers you see thriving through hot summers earned that reputation through years of root development. During the first growing season, that process is still underway. Here's how the June mistake shows up. Summer arrives. Rain becomes less predictable. Temperatures climb. And because the plant is supposed to be drought-tolerant, watering becomes less consistent. The coneflower survives for a while. Sometimes it even blooms, which makes everything appear fine. But underground, the root system isn't developing the way it should. The plant enters fall weaker. It enters winter weaker. And the following spring, it may struggle far more than expected. What to do instead? Focus on root development during that first season. Water deeply during extended dry periods. Not because the plant is fragile, but because you're helping it become the drought-tolerant perennial it's capable of being. Coneflowers are hardy throughout zones 3 through 9, and once established, they often become one of the easiest plants in the garden. But first they need time. And few plants demonstrate the June mistake more clearly than the next perennial on today's list. Number 4 is Sedum. If there is one plant on today's list that perfectly illustrates what we're talking about, it's Sedum. Most gardeners see a Sedum and immediately think the same thing, succulent. And when people hear succulent, they often assume one thing follows naturally: no watering required. Eventually, that can be true, but not during the first season. A newly planted sedum may have thick leaves that store moisture, but it still doesn't have the root system that makes mature sedum so dependable. Here's how the June mistake usually happens. A gardener plants a sedum in spring. The foliage looks healthy. Growth appears normal. Everything seems to be going exactly as planned. Because the plant is known for drought tolerance, watering gradually becomes less of a priority. After all, it's a sedum. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a bit, actually. The first 6 to 8 weeks after planting are some of the most important weeks in the plant's life. That's when roots begin spreading into the surrounding soil. That's when the plant starts building the foundation for years of future growth. And that's exactly when many gardeners stop paying attention. What to do instead? Provide consistent moisture during those early weeks. Not excessive watering, just enough consistency to support root development while the plant becomes established. Then gradually reduce supplemental watering as the season progresses. Sedum is hardy throughout zones 3 through 10, and once established, its reputation is absolutely deserved. It's one of the toughest perennials you can grow. But that toughness comes later, not during the first June. If this video has already helped explain why a perennial you've lost in the past may not have failed because of winter at all, take a moment to subscribe. Every week we look at common gardening mistakes, overlooked plant choices, and simple adjustments that can make a huge difference in long-term success. Now let's move to a perennial that's often purchased, specifically because gardeners want something easy. Number 5 is Catmint. Catmint has become one of the most recommended low-maintenance perennials in modern gardening, and for good reason. Bees love it, butterflies love it, and once established, it's remarkably forgiving, which creates a problem. People hear all those descriptions: easy, reliable, low maintenance, and they assume a newly planted catmint immediately behaves like a mature catmint. Here's how the June mistake shows up. The plant goes into the ground in spring. Growth starts quickly. Everything looks healthy. Then the first serious stretch of summer heat arrives. And because catmint has such a reputation for toughness, watering becomes less consistent than it should be. The plant doesn't always die. In fact, that's part of what makes this mistake so easy to miss. More often, establishment simply slows down, growth becomes weaker, and the plant never reaches the size or performance it could have achieved. What to do instead? Help the plant through that first summer. Deep watering during extended dry periods can make a tremendous difference. A light layer of mulch around the root zone can also help reduce moisture loss during the hottest weeks of the season. Catmint performs well throughout zones 3 through 8, and once established, it's easy to understand why experienced gardeners recommend it so often. By year 2, it often becomes one of the most dependable plants in the garden. But like every perennial on today's list, it still needs help getting there. The next perennial on our list proves that the June mistake isn't limited to sunny flower beds. Number 6 is Hosta. For decades, hostas have been one of the foundations of American shade gardens. Walk through almost any established neighborhood and you'll find them. Large clumps beneath mature trees, along shaded walkways, beside porches that receive very little direct sunlight. They're dependable, long-lived, and capable of filling difficult spaces where many other plants struggle. That's exactly why hostas have earned such a loyal following. But that reputation can also create a misunderstanding. Many gardeners assume that because hostas grow in shade, watering isn't nearly as important as it is for sun-loving perennials. After all, the soil doesn't look dry. The sun isn't beating down all day. Everything appears comfortable. And that's where the June mistake begins. A newly planted hosta enters its first summer. The leaves still look healthy. The bed appears reasonably moist from the surface. Nothing seems wrong. But what you're seeing on top doesn't always reflect what's happening below. While the surface may still hold moisture, the root zone can dry out much faster than people realize during stretches of warm weather. And unlike a mature hosta that's been growing in the same location for years, a newly planted hosta doesn't yet have the extensive root system needed to compensate. Here's how the June mistake shows up. The plant looks fine, so watering becomes inconsistent. The gardener assumes shade equals moisture, and because the decline often happens slowly, the connection isn't always obvious. The hosta survives, but it never truly thrives, or it enters winter weaker than it should. And the following spring, performance is disappointing. What to do instead? Look beyond the surface. Pay attention to the root zone. During that first growing season, consistent moisture helps hostas establish the strong root systems that eventually make them such reliable landscape plants. Hostas perform well throughout zones 3 through 9, and once established, many remain attractive for decades with very little intervention. That's why mature hostas often seem effortless. But they didn't start that way. They became that way. And the final perennial on today's list teaches the same lesson one last time. Number 7 is Salvia. Salvia has become one of the most widely planted perennial flowers in modern American landscapes, and it's easy to see why. Pollinators flock to the flowers. The color stands out in almost any border. And once established, Salvia has a well-earned reputation for toughness. But once again, that's where the June mistake appears. A gardener hears that Salvia thrives in difficult conditions. The plant goes into the ground. Growth begins. Everything looks healthy. And because the plant is supposed to be tough, watering gradually becomes less frequent. The assumption seems reasonable, but it's still the same mistake. A newly planted salvia is not an established salvia. Its root system is still developing, and that first summer remains the most important season in the plant's life. Here's what to do instead. Treat first-year salvia differently. Provide deep watering during extended dry periods. Focus on root establishment. Give the plant time to build the foundation that will support years of future growth. Salvia performs well throughout zones 4 through 8. And once established, it's easy to understand why gardeners continue planting it year after year. The maintenance is minimal, and the long-term performance is excellent, which brings us back to the lesson at the center of today's video. Peony, Daylily, Coneflower, Sedum, Catmint, Hosta, Salvia. 7 different plants, 7 different situations. And yet the same mistake affects every one of them. Many gardeners assume a newly planted perennial should behave like a mature perennial, but that's rarely how it works. The plants we've talked about today really can come back year after year. Some can remain in the same location for decades. But first, they need time to establish. They need roots before resilience. They need consistency before independence. And they need a little extra help during that critical first summer. If you've lost perennials in the past, it doesn't automatically mean you chose the wrong plant. It doesn't automatically mean your soil is poor, and it certainly doesn't mean you're a bad gardener. In many cases, the explanation is much simpler. The plant wasn't failing. It was still establishing, and somewhere during that first June, it was treated like a mature plant before it was ready. Avoid that mistake. Help your perennials through that first season, and many of them may reward you for years, and sometimes decades, to come. Let us know in the comments which perennial on today's list has been the most successful in your garden, and which one you're planning to grow next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.